Ready? Ghost. Ghost. Ghost.
Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with Peyton and Donna. They're my guests. Oh shoot. Guys, I'm just taking you over the So we're gonna go store. How do you feel, Donna?
Ghost. I'd love to live in this house.
Oh, really?
Watch your step, guys.
Don't step on a crap.
Break Momo's back.
What would any great haunted town be without its haunted mansion? I'm not exactly sure, but this is an interesting one. Originally built as a much smaller federal-style farmhouse in 1795. This was originally built by one Mr. Charles Bland at a time when this whole area was nothing but woods, hence the name that it has to this day, Blandwood Mansion. He occupied it at a time when there was almost nothing out here, nothing but trees. It was him, his wife, and their 6 children in a 4-room federal-style farmhouse. However, most of what you see when it comes to this house today was the result of the second set of owners, the Humphreys. More specifically, their daughter Anne Eliza and her husband, Governor John Motley Moorhead, who served as governor for 2 full terms and had an interesting agenda when it came to his politics. He was very in touch with reforming education, making prison life more accommodatable, expanding the railroads to North Carolina, which had an interesting price when the Civil War came around, and one thing that was actually quite controversial at the time, which was actually educating everyone regardless of race. Although, strangely enough, he still owned slaves, one of whom was not emancipated until she was about 105 years old. But regardless, he had an interesting agenda and was actually surprisingly against the secession when the Civil War was only a possibility, but eventually he gave in to peer pressure and joined the secession. Despite this, he and his family remained for a good 20 to 30 years after the end of the war, and approximately 20 years after the end of his term. But before any of that really started, he began expanding the house. Starting in 1846, he commissioned some of the most notable architects in the United States, many of whom were inspired by a recent revival in Gothic architecture, hence the way that the house looks. It was essentially being inspired by the French chateaux and the Irish churches and the Italian cathedrals to try and make it a little bit more than just your average, 4-story in suburbia as we know today. With that said, the house expanded outwards for Moorhead, his wife, and at time, their 8 children. And despite the fact that the family stayed there during the war and during Moorhead's terms, which occasionally could be controversial and occasionally could be a crowd pleaser, the tragedy did not truly strike until after his death. There had been a few deaths in the house before, but the first real string of tragedies happened, beginning with their daughter Emma and her husband Julius Gray, in the form of their child, returning home from boarding school in Virginia with what was referred to at the time as a touch of consumption, something that modern medicine refers to this day as tuberculosis. It was referred to as consumption at the time for its ability to seemingly feast away at the human body. Now, we know a lot more about medicine these days, but at the time, it was simply believed that the best answer was to quarantine the child, which seems fine in theory, not letting anybody in or out without permission, cutting off how many people could be exposed to them. The problem is that this house did not have the ventilation that we have in modern housing, and as a result, shutting somebody off with a respiratory condition, and especially someone whose body is still growing, away from fresh air, did not help the condition. The child died in 1895, followed by his father. There was a brief respite where it did not come back until a few years later, resulting in the death of, unfortunately, Emma and her 2 daughters. After the deaths, the family was not quite sure what to do with this massive house and its gardens, and so of all things, it was actually bought by the Kesey Institute, who owned a chain of rehabilitation clinics all across the United States. Now, some of you might not know, but this was at a time period when you could simply go into a local drugstore and buy really dangerous drugs, things akin to morphine or heroin, just over the counter on your way to get your Sunday morning wine. So these sorts of clinics were very necessary. Their claim to fame was a concoction simply known as the Gold Cure. It had everything mixed in. It had alcohol, It had a little bit of modern cannabis. It had a little bit of morphine. But strangely enough, the secret ingredient, well, not so secret as it was in the name, was gold salt. Highly addictive in its own right, but it had a high success rate in getting people off of other habit-forming substances. They operated fairly well. Whether or not anyone died as a result of the conditions living in the Juan Kesey Institute remains to be said. And digging through enough historical documents could probably find a few people dead of natural causes. But regardless, the center operated fairly successfully until an undercover investigative journalist by the name of Nellie Bly went to the White Plains Kesey Institute in the 1940s and found that it operated fairly well, but masquerading as an absinthe addict, she found that unfortunately they had a tendency of using needles that had not been sanitized in between patients. The scandal resulted in the Kesey Institute going bankrupt and all of the centers being shut down. In the 1960s, this entire building stood at risk of demolition, but the Greensboro Historical Society stepped in and decided to bring it back to the way it had once looked when it was operated by the governor and his family. And by 1966, this house had reopened as a historical museum full of all kinds of artifacts, many of which had to be painstakingly tracked down from collectors and antique dealers from all over the country who had gone through the collection once the family sold the house. They got it back to looking almost verbatim the way that it looked when Moorhead and his family operated here. But needless to say, the same way that humans can be nostalgic when we're alive, nostalgia can attract some people after they've passed. To this day, there are a number of things that are reported mostly by the staff, but also by the spectators. In that top window up there, there's said to be a woman as gray as the grave who occasionally peeks out of that window looking over the town. She is as still as a stone statue, but will occasionally fade away in the blink of an eye. Some say that she may be looking over the scenery that she saw when she was there. Some say she might be watching the way the town builds up over time while we mortals run around like ants on the hill. There are staff members who have often reported hearing voices around the house. A particular woman named Barbara once reported showing up for work one morning and joking, but not joking, saying hello to the house, only to hear a choir of voices say hello back to her. When a fellow employee showed up, Barbara was crouched in that bench over there, cowering. She begged to have the day off, and when they asked why, she explained she was given a week off. But she operated here for a good time afterwards, now that she knew a little bit of what she was dealing with. Other instances usually involve a bedroom that is not located on this side of the house, but rather on the opposite side. It is a room that contains several artifacts that belong directly to the family. Now, any piece of furniture that's hundreds of years old occasionally needs to be sent away in order to be touched up. It needs to be sanded here, it needs to be oiled here, a few fresh screws, make sure that there's no termites, make sure that there's nothing infesting it, that sort of thing. So every once in a while, it becomes necessary to send an antique bed that had once belonged to Emma away to a local antique restorer. It changes over time, but every time they've ever sent that bed away to be restored, all sorts of mischief happens throughout the house. Pictures will fall off of the wall, and sometimes they will tilt. Sometimes there will be glass and mirrors that are broken. There will be ice-cold drafts in the middle of summer, and of course, the pounding footsteps going up and down the stairs in opposite directions. The incidences became so common that it actually became necessary to commission a medium. And I don't mean a traditional television cold reader. I mean somebody who has enough spiritual sensitivity to be able to sometimes communicate with the other side. And she deduced that the most vocal ghosts of the house belonged to the two dueling sisters. Letitia, the first of the Moorhead children to die of natural causes some 10 years after the Civil War, and her younger sister Louise, who was not the first to die, but the one who perhaps had the greatest amount of tragedy. She bore 6 children during her lifetime, 3 of whom died during birth, 2 during infancy, and 1 before the age of 6. It is said that during their life, Louise and Letitia got along quite well, to the point that Louise named her final child and the one who lived the longest after her sister. But after death, the 2 of them have had feuds in the house that the staff will report on to this day. While there are the notions I've mentioned before of cracked glass, loud footsteps, and name-calling, the most common occurrence involves a music box that had belonged to the family a long time ago. It is said that the music box is designed and the automatics inside are meant to play a very cheerful, bubbling tune, the kind that would bring a smile to anyone of any age. But at certain points, the music box will go off by itself and play a haunting tone similar to the dirge heard in the theme of here, something that sends a chill into the hearts of all who hear it, to the point that the staff has made it a mission to never keep it in the same room of the house for longer than a day at a time. So it moves throughout in the hopes that there will be no incidences where the music box will go off on its own. It is sometimes even said that Moorhead himself can be heard in his own office, shuffling through his papers, storming back and forth, pacing as if in deep thought, perhaps over his own legacy, perhaps over what his legacy led to in the end. But there's one other particular incident that happens on certain nights of the year, and that is staff members who have been here after dark will report the sound of 3 sharp knocks on the door. It doesn't belong to the Dueling Sisters, nor does it belong to Moorhead himself. It is said it belongs to one of the last members of the house, who is a man.
Guys, we're going to our national venue. Flip it. Yeah, there's. No, you gotta put it all the way. Yeah, and then you gotta turn it. Oh. There you go. It's inverted, so you're.
What are you doing? Oh!
1927.
So we are going to the camera.
Now, just as it is nowadays, the theater not only for theatrical plays and dance productions, but also film screenings. However, at the time period, many film screening reels were highly flammable. They were made of a material called nitrate, and it had actually led to quite a few fires in the earliest movie houses across Europe. And so, when they built this building, it was a little bit later in the game, and it was still not 100% certain if film was even something that was going to survive. However, the architects of this building worked in something to make it a little bit safer, that being fireproof doors. Large metal sliding doors that would slam closed if the temperature of the room they were in reached a certain point. Similar to the thermometer that's located in your smoke detector that will go off when you're making toast. Well, okay, maybe only mine does that, but with this building, the fireproof doors are set in place, and they get in place relatively simply. There was one unfortunate man who died during construction while hanging up the massive chandelier that hangs in the auditorium. He was a workman dressed in gray clothes with suspenders who fell to his death partway through, and to this day he is sometimes seen by staff and actors alike. There's one particular day when one of the janitors noticed him sitting among the seats. He knew it was after hours and knew that the man had no business there, so he called after him, but the man stood up and began to walk away. The janitor chased after him, calling after him endlessly, but the man in the suspenders didn't respond. He disappeared into the men's restroom, and so the janitor followed, only to find that the restroom was empty, the lights were off. Yes. But the most famous ghost actually belongs to a woman who put those fireproof doors to use back in the 1980s, a woman by the name of Evelina Ferguson. Now, she was not an actor, nor was she employed at the theater. She was actually a patient at a pharmacist that was right across the way. Now, she was on a type of psychoactive medication, which one exactly I am not sure, but the withdrawal symptoms were quite vicious. So when she ran out of her prescription, she desperately tried to get it again and again and again, to the point that the pharmacist decided simply to throw her out. She was so desperate that she claimed that if she didn't get her refill, that Greensboro itself would burn. That night, she planned on making good her threat. She came here immediately afterwards and sat through a local production. It is unknown whether she tried to get her mind off of things by watching the play, or she had something more sinister in mind from the very beginning. But regardless, as soon as the play was over, she snuck backstage, climbed up the ladder, and went to a room upstairs that was currently being used to house big, thick, black curtains of duvetyn, which, if you don't know, is a very heavy fabric that is also quite flammable. She set fire to one of them. Within minutes, the fire erupted. She attempted to flee to save herself, but the fireproof doors slammed shut, trapping her. It wasn't until the next morning that the local fire brigade came in and found that most of the theater was actually still intact, but the top floor to this day still has evidence of the fire, char marks along the bricks, all kinds of burns in the pipes, and the imprint of the unfortunate young woman who succumbed to suffocation. To this day, folks who have gone on productions in this theater, and even those who have rehearsed here, will say that there is a mysterious woman who glows blue, as bright blue as an old stove flame. During a production of The Wizard of Oz, many of the children were in the middle of one particular scene when they observed that there was a glowing blue woman looking over them from the foyer level. They all stopped and were stunned to see her gazing down at them, almost longingly, before disappearing as suddenly as a flame extinguished in a saucer of water. To this day, Melvillina is seen during many productions, but there's one little piece of physical evidence that the staff uses to this day, and that being the great theater tradition of the ghost light. One thing anyone who's ever worked around a theater or a theater company will know is that theater people, whether they're actors or stagehands, are usually very superstitious. So it's a tradition in many theaters to leave a single light. In the olden days, it was merely a candle. Then it moved on to a gas light, then an electrical light, and nowadays an LED light that is said to only truly flicker if there's something unknown around it. Needless to say, there is a light that is kept on stage to keep the security cameras on standby, and it flickers nearly every single night and sometimes casts strange shadows on the wall. Sometimes Melvillina, sometimes the worker who died hanging the chandelier, and sometimes a child, also dressed in funeral attire, who the staff have nicknamed Christopher. As a final tale, I will tell you of the incident that happened to the stage manager, who was once upstairs when he began noticing that there was somebody in the aisle playing with the chairs that folded in like this at the time. Now, Christopher, the child in the funeral attire, is said to play with the chairs constantly, sometimes even when people are sitting. So, he saw the chair closing in and on of itself, and even heard a small laugh, a child's laugh, coming from the area. Jokingly, he saw a screw sitting on the ground and absent-mindedly kicked it into the auditorium. Within a moment, the screw was thrown back towards him with such force that it drove itself into the wall next to his eye, just barely missing him. Whether the child intended to give him a friendly warning or the child died before he could ultimately learn the value of mortality is unknown. But needless to say, sometimes we play a little bit too hard, and, well, if you died before you knew the definition of playing hard, it can have interesting consequences. That said, it's interesting that y'all have direct kindness, and has the performance already happened, or is that happening later?
Some of it
been all
has.
week, but they finish on Sunday.
Well, in the interest of keeping everything in the spirit of good luck, I will not wish all of you good luck with the performance so much as the classic theater tradition, as morbid as it may be, of break a leg. And also don't say Macbeth. With that said, I want to thank all of you for joining me tonight. I hope that you'll find it informative, and I also appreciate everyone's patience with me. I hope that y'all heard it okay, but I'm guessing there's some stuff that may have been lost to the folks in the very back. Ow, that's actually kind of surprising. Well, with that said, I do hope that the performance ultimately goes well. Thanks for joining us in this unlikely city, and, well, remember when you go to wherever you're sleeping tonight, that if you think you hear something scratching at the window or a footstep in the empty room overhead, just remember, it's only your imagination. Probably. Well, the good thing is we're all parked together, so technically I can at least walk y'all back the rest of the way.
Yeah. Guys, if you see a blue person, it's not real. It's not real. If you see someone blue, you don't. It's imagination.
Yeah. So we just did the ghost tour.
One of the little, the tiny ones, like scribblers.
Keep walking. It's just a light.
Yeah. It is the light, guys. It is the light.
It's just a light. Okay, and you want to hold it? Well, hold on. Can you grab which? goodbye. Say your goodbyes.
Bye, guys.
So who's gonna edit?